The Federal Reserve and Jerome Powell are now predicting the dreaded stagflation for the United States economy, where prices continue to go higher and higher and higher, along with the unemployment rate.
On Wednesday, Powell said, quote, unemployment is likely to go up as the economy slows. In all likelihood, and inflation is likely to go up as tariffs find their way and some part of those tariffs come to be paid by the public, end quote. He didn't use the exact word, but what he was describing is stagflation.
I'm going to explain why they're making this dire prediction and whether or not I agree in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over this insider intel from the Cleveland Fed. They have this algorithm or this real-time inflation tool they call Nowcasting. So we look at this chart to kind of the beginning of May back to April 1st. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to predict what the next CPI print will be, and therefore how the Fed is going to use that to determine whether or not they're going to cut interest rates at their next meeting. On the left, we go from 0% up to 5%. So at the beginning of April, it was right around 2.3, which was last month's reading, I believe. And so then they go down here. Why? Because energy prices have really collapsed. Just last week, oil got down to $55 a barrel. So again, this red line, which represents the headline CPI, and that's the inflation rate you usually see expressed in the mainstream media, it goes down below 2%. In fact, almost down to 1% here. And then it kind of goes back up right around 1.5 or so. And then going into May, it goes up slightly. But I want you to pay very close attention to this blue line, because according to the Fed, this is what they use to determine whether or not they're going to cut interest rates, hike interest rates, or pause. Now, this is the core CPE, but you can see it's very similar to the Fed's favorite metric, which is the core PCE. Editor, you can go ahead and display this on the chart we've got. But what the Nowcasting tool is predicting for the month of April is that we started right around at 3%. We dipped down to call it 2.6, and then it's pretty much flat. Now, this is key because the Fed wants this to be at 2%. So from the Fed's standpoint, they're looking at this and saying, okay, inflation is quote unquote sticky. You hear that in the mainstream media all the time. And this is the reason why. So they're looking out in the economic horizon and seeing tariffs come in. They're expecting that to increase prices. So it looks like with the CPI, they're expecting energy prices to kind of rebound and food prices to go back up. So they're concerned that this blue line, as well as this red line, is going to continue to go higher and higher and higher because of tariffs uncertainty, because of supply shortages, very similar to what we saw during 2021 and 2022. But at the same time, they're looking at the labor market and they're seeing the data starting to get soft. As an example, last non-farm payroll was 177,000, which exceeded expectations, but it was a lot lower than the month prior. So the trend is definitely down. Now, I also want to point out that when you look at these consumer surveys, they call this the soft data, you see that inflation expectations are really, really high for 2025. And I know this skews Democrat, but the Republicans are expecting prices to go up as well. So the Fed believes that if there are inflation expectations, then the consumer will go out and start stockpiling stuff because they're going to go out and front run the higher prices. Now, I don't buy into this for a variety of reasons, but what I'm doing is I'm just showing you how the Fed views the economy. So when you combine the tariffs with the higher inflation expectations that we see in the soft data, and then you get the softening in the labor market, this is why Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve are predicting that the United States is going to go into stagflation. Now, the key here is asking ourselves, what tools does the Fed have to not just prevent stagflation, but to prevent unemployment going higher or to prevent prices from going higher or lower for that matter? Can they actually do anything even if this is their concern.
Step number 2. Now we're going to reveal the truth about the Federal Reserve that they don't want you to know. Let's start by looking at a chart of the current yield curve. So at the front of the curve, we have the overnight rate. This is the federal funds rate, and this is the rate that they control. So when Jerome Powell comes out on CNBC and says we paused or we cut rates by 25 basis points or we increased rates, they're talking about the overnight rate, the Fed funds. But then there's several other points on this curve. We've got the 1 month, 2 month, 3 month, the 2 year, the 10 year, the 30 year. And you guys hear about the 10-year all the time because this is most correlated to mortgages, which impacts obviously a lot of Americans. But look at the shape of the curve right now. So what I want you to focus on initially is the 6 month to, let's just call it the 10-year. So pretty much the entire portion of this curve is below the overnight rate, where the Fed has their interest rates, or where they paused and kept them at, let's just say, 4.25%. So let's just do a quick thought experiment and ask ourselves, what would have happened to these interest rates if the Fed would have dropped by 25 basis points? Would that have impacted the 2-year, the 3-year, the 10-year, the 30-year? Maybe a little, but probably not that much. Where you would have seen the impact is just pretty much on the 1 month T-bill to the 6 month T-bill. So now I want you to ask yourself the question, do you really think that a plus or minus 25 basis points on the 1 month to 6 month T-bill will dramatically impact inflation, higher or lower? Or do you think the plus or minus 25 basis points from the 1 month T-bill to the 6 month T-bill will dramatically impact the unemployment rate? Of course not. This is nonsense. And let's go through another quick thought experiment. Let's just assume that Trump has a across the board 10% tariff, just to keep the math easy. So what would happen to the prices of those imports? Well, they would go up. And let's just say they go up by 5%, just to keep the example simple again. So now you've got that basket of goods, consumer prices, and some of the items go up by 5%. Great. Let's just assume that the Fed had interest rates 25 basis points higher, again, between the 1 month and the 6 month T-bill. Is that going to impact what the prices of those imports are? Of course not. That held no bearing whatsoever on the Chinese widget maker charging X as opposed to Y. They're going to charge whatever it is they're going to charge based on their bottom line and the amount of Trump's tariffs. What Jerome Powell does with the overnight rate holds no bearing on that whatsoever. So then you have to ask the question, okay, well, why is he even worried about inflation? Well, he's worried about it because prices of those things might go up, but this doesn't mean that they're going to continue to go up. Pretty much what happens when you have this, let's say 5% price adjustment, is prices go up by 5%, and then that's it. It's not like they go up by 5%, then 10%, then 20, then 30, then 40, just because you have a 5% tariff. So the whole point here is really the Fed just controls the front end of the curve, and it's just out to a 6 month T-bill. And I don't think that anyone in their right mind would argue that has a dramatic impact on prices, unemployment, or what the Chinese charge for their widgets that they're importing to the United States based on the tariffs. And the reason for this, again, is because most of the curve is under the Fed funds rate right now. So if they were to lower it, they're just coming down to where the rest of the curve is. And at the long end, let's say the 10-year and the 30-year, they really don't respond too much to the Fed funds rate. They more so respond to growth and inflation expectations. So the bottom line is whatever's going to happen in the economy is going to happen, regardless of the Fed. The only thing they can do is just react to it. It's like someone driving a car. Most people think, and the mainstream media would like you to believe, that the Fed is actually at the wheel, when in reality, they're in the back seat.
Step number 3. So what is my prediction for the U.S. economy? Do I agree or disagree with the Fed? Well, most of you know from watching my videos, there's a very high probability I'm going to disagree with the Federal Reserve. But let's get into it by looking at a chart of the CPI. Now, this chart, 1983 all the way back to 1970. This is the infamous decade of the 1970s. Why was it infamous? Because of stagflation. On the left, we go from 0% up to 15%. Now, this red line represents, of course, the rate of inflation. By the way, back then, I think they measured it a lot more accurately than they do today. So we start 1970 right around 5 or 6%. We go down till we get to about 1973. We're hovering around, let's just call it 3, 4%. And then it goes straight up to a point where we're right around 10, 12%. Then it comes all the way down to say 5 or 6% before it rebounds, re-accelerates, and then goes straight up to 14% before Volcker put the brakes on it. And that's a controversial issue as well. But that's when Volcker came in and got the credit for putting the brakes on it that took inflation all the way back down to a lower level that we saw throughout the 1980s. So a couple things I think you'll find extremely interesting. From 1970 to 1974, M2 money supply went up by 50%. Now, I know a lot of you right about now are saying to yourself, oh, George, 50%? That's absolutely nothing compared to what we've seen recently, let's just say from 2020 to 2024. We know that just in about a 12-month time, the Fed increased M2 money supply by 25% alone. And therefore, any analogy or any comparison that you have to the 1970s is a complete moot issue. But you got to look at the data. So editor, go ahead and throw up a chart, and we can see that from 2020 to 2024, M2 money supply grew by 35%. In other words, 15% less than it grew from 1970 to 1974. More on that in just a moment. Now, a lot of you are probably also saying, well, you can't use this as a good example because we have all these tariffs. Yeah, but think about what we had in 1974, right at the beginning. We had oil skyrocket. Editor, go ahead and throw up a chart of this as well. So this is very similar to what we might experience with the tariffs. Why? Because oil is an input to almost every single good you buy, whether it was made from oil or oil was used to transport it from A to B. So my point here is the number of currency units, or M2 money supply, however you want to say it, was a lot higher in the 1970s than it is today, or it has been since the cerveza sickness. And we do have a very disruptive component for the economy. Now it might be tariffs, but back then it was oil. So now let's kind of focus on where the recessions were during the 1970s and into the early 1980s. So the first recession starts right around, editor, you can help me out with this one, but let's just say right about here. Okay, so you'll notice that this point where we started the recession is a lot higher than it is when we exited the recession and bottomed out. Let's just say we exited the recession around right here and the CPI continued to go down. But you see the exact same thing happened in the next recession that started, let's say, around here, and then we come out around, well, there's a couple of recessions back to back, we come out right around here. So the main takeaway is even in the 1970s, the decade that is known for stagflation, the CPI, or the rate of inflation, was lower when you came out of the recession than it was at the beginning of a recession. So, what I'm highlighting is recessions in the United States are always disinflationary, meaning you don't see a recession where prices or the rate of inflation, prices will go up, but the rate of inflation goes higher and higher and higher and higher, along with the unemployment rate going higher and higher and higher. It's always, you see this big spike in the unemployment rate at the beginning or the middle of the recession, and then you get that disinflation that we were talking about. And the exact same thing here. Unemployment rate spikes, then you get the disinflation. So my prediction is when we have a recession, whether that's 2025 or 2026, and we see the unemployment rate spike, it'll play out the exact same way it's played out every single time throughout modern US history, and that is the rate of inflation going down, not going up.
Hey guys, I'd like to personally invite each and every one of you to attend this year's Rebel Capitalist Live. This is the incredible conference I put on annually that helps you build a bulletproof portfolio. It helps you increase your personal freedom and liberty, and also it helps you increase the size of your network. In other words, you get to meet a lot of like-minded individuals, fellow rebel capitalists. It's in Orlando, May 23rd through the 25th. Past speakers have included people like Robert Kiyosaki, Ron Paul, Peter Schiff, Mike Maloney, Lynn Alden, just to name a few. So to get your tickets ASAP and to find out who is speaking at this year's Rebel Capitalist Live, you can check it out at rebelcapitalistlive.com. And just a little quick insider information, if you get your tickets sooner than later, you can get a discount because as we get closer and closer to the event, the tickets go up in price. So don't wait. Go to rebelcapitalistlive.com right now and get your tickets, and I will see you in Orlando, May 23rd through the 25th.